Welcome back, everyone. This is Obi with Old Book Time Traveler. We're going to read some more out of our storybook. Kind of reads like a storybook, doesn't it? The Pictorial History of the United States. We left off on Chapter 11. Weakness of the colony. While a part of the colonists were busy in clearing the soil and building suitable huts and fortification, Captain Newport, in company with Captain John Smith, ascended the James River to the falls and visited Powhatan, the chief of the Indians in those parts, at his principal seat, just where Richmond now stands. It was a village of only 12 wigwams. Captain Newport left the colony about the middle of June for England. No settlement was ever left in more pitiable condition. To say nothing of the danger from the savage foes, the provisions were poor and insufficient. The water was unwholesome, and the summer heat intolerable to those who had been accustomed to cooler climate. Many of them were sick, and those who were not sick were discouraged. In less than a fortnight after the departure of the fleet, hardly 10 of them were able to stand, nor so many as 5 fit to guard the fort or plant crops for future sustenance. The sickness increased till in some instances 3 or 4 died in a night. 50 of them, or about half of the colony, perished before autumn came on. To complete the catalogue of evils, they quarreled among themselves. They first excluded from the council Captain Smith, professedly on the account of sedition, but really and truly from motives of envy. Next they disposed Mr. Wingfield, the president, and appointed Mr. Radcliffe in his stead, who was no better, and thus things for some time went on. They discovered at last that Captain Smith, whom they had so much hated, was the best man among them, and their chief dependence. In truly, they could not do without him in peace or in war. Money with him was not, as was with most men, and especially of this colony, a main object, but the good of his fellow men. This Captain Smith became so identified with the history of the colony, and indeed with the history of our race, that it may well to give a more particular account of him, his birth, education, and adventures in early life. Chapter 12, Captain John Smith, his life and adventures. Captain John Smith making treaties with the Indians. This most remarkable man of all the first settlers of Jamestown was born in Lincolnshire, England, in 1579. He was put as an apprentice to a merchant at the age of 15, but disliking the business, he left his master, proceeded to Holland, enlisted for a time as a soldier, and at length found his way to Austria. Here he entered the Austrian army, then engaged in war with the Turks. After many singular adventures, and not a few hazardous exploits in single combat, having in 3 several instances cut off the heads of his antagonists, he was at length wounded, taken prisoner, and on his recovery sold as a slave. In this situation he conducted so well as speedily to win the confidence of his new mistress, who, with a view to restore him his freedom, sent him to her brother, an officer at the Crimea in Russia. Here, contrary to her expectations, he was put to the severest drudgery, and his life made a burden. Determined to escape from his new master, he at length found a convenient opportunity. He was employed at threshing, about 3 miles from the house. Here his master visited him once a day. Watching his opportunity, Smith dispatched him with a flail, hid his body in the straw, and mounting his horse, fled to the woods. After wandering several days, uncertain of his fate, he came to a guidepost by means of the marks which he had found his way. Thus he returned through Russia, Poland, Germany, and France to his native country, not, however, till he had turned aside through Spain to visit the kingdom of Morocco and spent a short time there. He reached England just as the companies were forming for settling the new continent of America. As he had lost none of his courage or bravery, he was most admirably adapted to the hazardous undertaking. He was immediately attached to the expedition under Captain Newport, and made, as we have seen, one of the members of the Virginia Council. Small bodies of men, when exposed to great danger, are for the most part united amongst themselves, but it was not so true as we have seen with the Jamestown colony. There was no bond of union even in the hour of danger. To restore harmony, then, was the first object at which Smith aimed. Peace and order by his efforts being at length restored, he found leisure to do something towards defending the colony from foes without. The Indians threatened them. But his ingenuity, he succeeded in quieting them for the present as well as removing the fears which had agitated the colony. Chapter 13. Smith taken prisoner. Smith going to an exploring excursion. As soon as the colony became secure and was well supplied with provisions, Smith undertook a short voyage of discovery. An opinion prevailed among the first voyagers to America, into which Smith had fallen among the rest, that it was only a little way across the country to the South Sea, the ocean path to every sort of wealth. They supposed that by ascending most any river which came from the northwest, they could soon find a passage by water thither. The Chickahominy is a branch of the James, uniting with it a little above Jamestown. With a handful of associates, Smith ascended it in a barge as far as it was boatable, and then leaving the barge with the part of the men who were to remain aboard, ascended in a canoe still higher. He had no sooner left the boat than the crew went ashore at the very spot where the brother of Powhatan, with some Indians, lay in ambush. They seized one of the men, and after having compelled him to tell them which way their commander had gone, they cruelly murdered him and then followed after Smith. Having proceeded about 20 miles, they overtook and killed the companions of Smith and wounded him. They then surrounded and attempted to take him, but though wounded, he defended himself until he had killed 3 of his assailants. Then he sunk deep in the marsh and was taken. Smith knew the character of Indians and set about devising expedients to prolong his life. He took from his pocket a compass and amused his guards by showing them the vibrations of the needle. He also endeavored to give them some feeble notions of the earth and of the visible heavenly bodies. He also made use of other little devices to gain time. But what most excited the wonder of the savages was the fact that he could make a few marks on paper, from which the colonists of Jamestown could understand him and comply with his request, for, as he was some time among the Indians, they permitted him to make the experiment. For a while they regarded him as some sort of magician whom it might not be safe to destroy. They concluded at length, however, to conduct him to Powhatan. He was therefore bound for his purpose and brought before the king, whom he found seated on a wooden throne with 2 girls, his daughters, at his side. After consultation with his principal men, it was determined to put him to death, and they proceeded to make the preparation. Chapter 4. Story of Pocahontas. 2 large stones were brought in and laid at the feet of the savage king, and Smith's head was placed on one of them, while the savages gathered around to witness the execution. Powhatan's club was raised, and everyone was waiting in silent suspense to see if it would fall on the victim. At this critical instant, Pocahontas, the eldest of the daughters, and the most beloved by the king, now scarcely 12 years of age, rushed forward and threw herself with a shriek on Smith. Her hair was loose and her eyes wild and streaming with tears, and she raised her hands to her father and besought him, with all the power of Indian eloquence, to spare his captive. This is Pocahontas. And you can see John Smith back here being captive. Powhatan, though little used to pity, could not resist her entreaties and tears. He dropped his uplifted club and looked around upon his warriors as if to gather new courage, and they too were touched with pity, though they were savages. At last he raised his daughter and promised her to spare the prisoner's life, and he was accordingly spared the very next day, conducted by a guard of 12 men to Jamestown. He had been a prisoner about 7 weeks. He was sent back by the guard 2 cannons and a grindstone, for which Powhatan was to let him have a large tract of country and forever regard him as his son. He reached Jamestown in safety, but not wishing to send guns to the savages, he determined to frighten them. However, he brought forward the 2 cannons and a grindstone, and they thought them too heavy to carry. Then he discharged the cannon loaded with stones among the trees, which so affected them that they were glad to return to Powhatan with a quantity of toys and trinkets in their stead. Powhatan was greatly pleased with the presents, but Indian friendships are not always permanent. Some time afterward, his savage feelings became again excited against the English, and a plan was laid for cutting them all off at a blow, which, but for the interference of Pocahontas, would probably have succeeded. The day and the hour were set, and Pocahontas was informed of both. The very night before the deed was done, in the midst of the terrible storm, which with the thick darkness kept the savages in their huts, Pocahontas proceeded to Jamestown and revealed the plot. The colonists were therefore on their guard, and part of them saved. This first plot to massacre the English took place in 1609. This does not appear that the savages ever found out who revealed their plot, for Pocahontas remained at her father's house for some time afterward. In the meantime, with the aid of Captain Smith, peace was once more established between the 2 nations. Pocahontas, having now become the warm friend of the English, came every few days to the fort at Jamestown with her basket full of corn for the garrison, which proved of great service to them. At length, however, she was stolen by a foraging party of white people, and a large sum was demanded of her father for her ransom. Powhatan was unwilling to comply with the terms proposed, and began to prepare for war on the English, and had it not been for an event that's as singular as it was unforeseen, a most exterminating war would doubtless have arisen. A young man by the name of Rolfe proposed to marry Pocahontas, and the proposal met the approbation of the king. She professed the faith of the Christian religion, and was baptized in a font hewn from the trunk of a tree in the little rugged church at Jamestown, and soon after was married. She became a faithful wife, an exemplary and pious mother. Some of the principal families in Virginia descended from this union of a young planter with an Indian princess. In 1616, Pocahontas went with her husband to England, but she was very unhappy there. Captain Smith, who was in London at the time of her arrival, called to see her, but on account of her color was a little reserved in his manner of treatment. This added to the intensity of her feelings, and she wept like a child. Captain Smith inquired the cause of her grief. "Did I not save thy life," she said, "in America, when I was torn from the arms of my father and conducted among thy friends? Didst thou not promise to be a father to me? Didst thou not say that if I went into thy country, thou wouldst be my father, and I should be thy daughter? Thou hast deceived me, and behold me here now, a stranger and an orphan." Captain Smith could not resist such eloquence. He introduced her to many families of respectability, and did all he could, while she remained in England, to make her happy, except that he never ventured to bring her before the king. She fell victim to the united influence of grief and the climate, and died at the age of 22, as she was about to embark for America. Chapter 15. Captain Smith's Voyages of Discovery. During the captivity of Captain Smith, he had been carried in triumph by the Indians from the Chickahominy River to their villages on the Rappahannock and Potomac, and thence through their other settlements to the Pamunkey River, and finally to the lower residence of Powhatan, in what is now called Gloucestershire County. "It is an ill wind that blows nobody any good," says an old but current and just maxim, and the captivity of Smith, though an evil in itself, had its advantages. It gave him such a knowledge of the country and of the character and condition of the native inhabitants as proved to be of the highest importance afterward, both to him and the colony. We have seen already that the number of settlers at Jamestown had been much dismissed before the massacre of the men who went out with Smith. Some had also died during his absence. From 105 who came over, he found them reduced on his return to 40, and of these a part were just contrived to desert the colony. Attempts had been made at desertion twice before. Captain Smith resolved to put a stop to this, even if it cost him his life, and he succeeded in doing so, but the state of things in Jamestown was exceedingly discouraging. The government was of no force whatever, and everything would have gone to ruin but for his courage and determination. At this critical period in history of the colony, Captain Newport arrived from England with 120 emigrants. The news of his arrival in James River raised the drooping courage of the people and diffused general joy. It is not improbable that the point on the James River, which is known as the name of the Newport News, is the point from which his vessel was first discovered. But the joy was of short duration. The newcomers, like too many of those who first immigrated, were chiefly vagabond gentlemen, as the settlers called them, the Goat and Goldsmiths. The latter, no doubt, came over filled with the idea of obtaining gold. None of them, however, expected to earn their living by hard work. All they thought or talked of was about digging, washing, refining, and carrying away the most precious of metals. Even Martin, one of the council, and Captain Newport himself became absorbed, if indeed their brains were not actually turned with the idea of finding gold. Martin claimed, no doubt sincerely, that he had discovered a gold mine, and Newport, after loading his vessel with what proved to be worthless yellow earth, believed himself to be rich and returned to England. Worn out with fruitless endeavors to direct the attention of his people to something more important than searching for gold, Captain Smith undertook to explore the inlets, rivers, and shores of the Chesapeake Bay. This he accomplished in the course of 2 voyages in an open boat and with only 14 men. These voyages were undertaken and completed in about 3 months. He ascended the Potomac, above where Washington now stands, discovered and explored the Patapsco, and is thought to enter the harbor of Baltimore. The whole distance traveled was estimated about 3,000 miles. But to explore merely was not all that Captain Smith accomplished. He journeyed into the interior and made treaties of the peace and friendship with many tribes of the natives. He also prepared and sent over to the London Company a map of the country, which is still to be seen and is very correct. This expedition, considering all the circumstances, is one of the most wonderful on record, and displays not only skill and perseverance in Smith, but far-sighted and statesman-like wisdom. Chapter 6, Smith's Administration of the Government. Captain Smith, President. This is Chapter 16. In 3 days after his return from his voyage up the Chesapeake Bay, Captain Smith, not yet 30 years of age, was made president of the Virginia Council, in a worthy of remark that of the 7 members of the council who came over about a year before, all but Smith and Kendall were now dead, or degraded, or devoted to the gold business. Not long after the appointment of Smith as president, Captain Newport came out from England with 70 more immigrants, 2 of whom were females. Of nearly 300 immigrants who had now come over, these appeared to have been the only females who had yet ventured to join the colony. From the complaints of Smith to the London Company, it appears that the character of this 3rd set of immigrants was no better than the former. "I entreat you," he said, "rather send but 30 carpenters, husbandmen, gardeners, fishermen, blacksmiths, masons, and diggers up of tree roots, well provided, than 1,000 of such as we have." Smith was indefatigable in his endeavors to establish among the colonists habits of order and industry. His maxim was, "He who will not work should not eat," and he had some success. Several of the gentlemen colonists became woodcutters. They were required to labor 6 hours a day for the common good. The rest of the time they had to themselves. At length, Jamestown began to have the appearance of regular and comfortable abode. It is true that they had yet scarcely 50 acres of soil under cultivation, and were obliged to get their food in part from the Indians and from England, yet they were now improving their condition. They were also healthier, only 7 having died during the year of 1608. Toward the close of this year, a fleet of 7 vessels arrived with about 300 immigrants. 9 vessels had set out, but 2 of them had wrecked at the West Indies. But Smith could hardly rejoice at the arrival of rakes and libertines, and people who were packed off, as many of them were, to escape worse destinies at home. Something, however, must be done with them. One plan of his was to form new colonies. More than 100 went up the falls of the James River and began a settlement, and 100 more up the Nansemond. Both parties, however, offended the Indians and were either destroyed or driven away. A great misfortune now befell the colony of Jamestown. Captain Smith, being severely wounded by the accident and almost worn out of his sufferings and the ingratitude of his employers, departed for England, leaving the government for time to one Percy. Captain Smith was without doubt a most remarkable man. Few men are better calculated to be pioneers in settling a wilderness than he. Few could have seen more clearly in what the true interest of a rising settlement consisted, and still fewer would have been equally disinterested. Feelings deep and painful, no doubt, he had, for who has them not, in situations so trying as this? Yet, as Mr. Bancroft well remarks, he was the father of Virginia, the true leader who first planted the Saxon race within the borders of the United States. We shall have occasion to mention him again in the history of New England. He died in London in 1631, aged 52 years. Chapter 17. The Colony on the Verge of Ruin. Lord Delaware arrives. The departure of Captain Smith for England was like the last setting of the sun to the colony of Jamestown, at least for a time. No place ever went more rapidly on towards ruin. Order and industry disappeared, and the Indians not only became less friendly, but actually began to assume a hostile attitude and to renew their outrages. Nor was this all, or indeed the worst. The indolence and bad conduct of the settlers brought on a famine in the colony. Their want of food became so distressing that they devoured the skins of horses, as well as dead bodies of those persons who died or were slain, whether of their own party or of the Indians. To add to the distress, 30 of them escaped and became pirates. In the short period of 6 months after Captain Smith's departure, the number of colonists was in one way or another reduced from 50 to 60. These from 500. Wow. It was reduced from 500 to 60. These, moreover, were so feeble and discouraged that they were wholly unfit to defend themselves against the Indians, so that the colony was daily and hourly in actual danger of perishing. In this dreadful condition, little short of despair, they resolved on returning to England. But the decision was scarcely made when one of the vessels which had been shipwrecked in the West Indies 6 months before, and whose crew and passengers had wintered there, arrived in the river and landed at Jamestown. The wretched, despairing colonists were now urged to remain. They were once more 200 in number. But no pleadings of Sir Thomas Gates, who was to be their presiding officer till the arrival of Lord Delaware, could prevail with them. Their plan was to sail for Newfoundland, and scatter themselves amongst the vessels engaged in fishing there, and thus find their way back to England. They had 4 pinnacles remaining in the river, into which they entered, through almost without provisions, even for the voyage to the Newfoundland. They had even resolved, strange to say, on burning the town when they left it, and the energy of Gates, who at the last moment endeavored to persuade them to remain, was barely sufficient to prevent it. They actually set sail on their voyage, but just as they reached the mouth of the river, such was the ordination of Providence, Lord Delaware, with provisions and more emigrants, arrived from England. This inspired them with a little courage, and as there was a favorable wind, the whole company bore up the river and slept that night at the fort in Jamestown. Lord Delaware began his wise administrating next morning with religious exercises, after which he caused his commission to be read, upon which a consultation was held and a new government organized, in accordance with the wishes of the London Company and their commissioners. Much is said about historians in praise of the wisdom, firmness, and piety of Lord Delaware. It is recorded that the first business of each day was to assemble early in the morning in their little church, which was kept trimmed with wild flowers of the country, and there to invoke the presence and blessing of God, after which they repaired to their daily labors. And I think we'll stop there. So I hope you enjoyed our adventures with Captain John Smith. And our history of the United States. Thanks for joining me. This is Obi with Old Book Time Traveler. Have a good evening, travelers.